You have no idea how exciting it is for us to be here again in Santa Barbara. Whenever we've spoken here, we've always found that the audience has been so receptive and so supportive of our work, and thank you. We're just excited to speak to you this evening. And the subject of our presentation this evening is Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. His role in northern Alta California, especially the North Bay, was similar to the role of José de la Guerra y Noriega, one of your favorite people here in central Alta California. Vallejo was the most significant figure during the period in which Alta California was part of the Mexican Republic. Now, he was born at the end of the Spanish era, and he followed in his father Ignacio's footsteps by entering into the military. He quickly became an important officer at Monterey and San Francisco. After an 1833 trip to Fort Ross, he became very associated with the North Bay region. The following year, he was appointed comisionado to carry out the secularization of Mission San Francisco Solano. In 1835, he laid out the plaza of the pueblo of Sonoma. Vallejo arrived in Sonoma as military commander for most of the remainder of the Mexican era. At times, he was commander for the Northern District of Alta California, and at other times, he was commander for Alta California as a whole. It was in Sonoma that Vallejo was arrested in 1846 by the Bear Flaggers.
And after he was released and the Americans took over, the U.S. military chief appointed Vallejo as sub-agent for the Indians on the north side of the Bay of San Francisco. He served as a delegate from Sonoma at the 1849 Constitutional Convention, and he represented Sonoma as a member of the state Senate in the first California legislature. During the 1850s and early 1860s, he served twice as mayor of Sonoma. And even as he lost most of his land to squatters and court rulings during the subsequent decades, he retained a public position as a leading citizen of the North Bay and as one of the most important Californios who had been active in public life before the U.S. conquest. Vallejo's well-known reputation was why he was contacted by Hubert Howe Bancroft in the mid-1870s. And this in turn led to Vallejo's authorship of the most comprehensive and the most detailed history of Alta California, written by anyone who lived in the region before the U.S. takeover. And our complete translation of the Recuerdos, as he entitled his history, has just been published. But Vallejo's interest in the history of his homeland predated Bancroft's contact with him. During the first decade of American rule, the 1850s, Vallejo became acutely aware of the generalized disdain for Mexico and Mexicans that the newly arrived Americans brought to California with them. And he therefore decided to compose a history of pre-US California. He mentioned to a friend that he was doing this so that the Americans might realize
when they took over this country, there was a civilization and men who belonged to a race equal to, if not better than theirs.
Vallejo believed that the combination of his military, political, and family experiences in Alta California before, during, and after the U.S. takeover had given him a uniquely important perspective on California's past. As he told a British travel writer in 1874,
"My biography is the history of California." However, a fire in 1867 at his Casa Grande on the Sonoma Plaza destroyed this manuscript, and Vallejo sadly and reluctantly abandoned this project. His wife, Francisca Benicia, wrote to their daughter, Adela, about the fire at the Casa Grande. She said, "Yesterday at 3:30 in the afternoon, the Casa Grande in Sonoma burned down. The house in which we lived for so many years. The house that your father built with his own hands so that we could all live in it together. I cried as if one of my own children had died. That house is where my children were raised, where you all left your marks and scribbles on the walls when you were little. As the house was burning, I went to see it to say goodbye. I watched it burn for 4 hours. Napoleon and I were the only ones watching the fire burn down the house. Your father and your uncle Salvador refused to go and see it. People from all over the valley were in the plaza. It almost seemed like a party atmosphere. Everyone worked so hard to try and put out the fire. It was a miracle that the barracks were spared. Now, even though Vallejo's manuscript didn't survive the fire, a rich collection of documents, primary source documents, did survive. In the spring of 1874, Enrique Cerruti, who was a member of Hubert Howe Bancroft's staff, visited Vallejo. The purpose of the visit was to try and gain access for Bancroft of the documents that had survived the fire, because Bancroft wanted to use these documents as sources for the history of California he was beginning to conceptualize. Vallejo was a very smart, and I would say shrewd, and I say that respectfully, a shrewd man. He saw Cerruti's visit as an opportunity. He therefore agreed to share a few of his documents on the condition that he could dictate to Cerruti his recollections on the history of Alta California. Bancroft had such a strong desire to eventually access Vallejo's documents that he agreed with this proposal. Vallejo worked on composing his history for a year and a half. He completed all 5 volumes in August 1875. As he wrote in a letter to his wife, Francisca Benicia, on August 23rd, 1875, "This week I will finish the history." And he put 3 exclamation points after that. So we all know what it's like to finish a project.
Now, Vallejo believed that his history would make a unique contribution to the understanding of California's past and present. Less than a month after he started collaborating with Cerruti, Vallejo told Cerruti that his manuscript was going to contain material that was very different from what other people had written about California's past, and in that he was correct. His final manuscript focused on a group of themes that he believed were crucial to a full and complete understanding of the California experience. He believed that each of these themes had been significant in Alta California before the U.S. conquest. He also believed that his and his family's experiences in U.S. California demonstrated that these themes continued to be relevant after California ceased to be a part of the Spanish Empire and part of the Mexican Republic. Vallejo believed that by appreciating these themes, the Anglos who now ruled California might better understand California's past history, its present realities, and its future possibilities. And in this brief presentation, we'd like to focus on 4 of these themes. First of all, Vallejo emphasized the role that ordinary soldiers had in the conquest and settlement in Alta California and in creating possibilities for the eventual acculturation of California's indigenous peoples. Emphasis on this theme was a conscious effort on Vallejo's part to contest a mission-centric interpretation of California's past that was already beginning to develop here in the Golden State. The incipient popularity in the 1870s of paintings and photographs of mission ruins by people like Lemuel Wiles, Carlton Watkins, and others was already laying the groundwork for the Spanish revival movement that emphasized and romanticized California's mission past. But Vallejo argued that soldiers were just as important as missionaries, and in some cases even more so. At the very start of his Recuerdos, he praised
the efforts of the self-sacrificing military men who, along with the missionaries, were able to free this beautiful land from the hands of the barbarous Indians.
He insisted
Gaspar de Portola and the heroic troops under his command are, in my opinion, just as deserving of being considered worthy conquerors of Alta California as the Venerable Fray Junipero Serra and the selfless men who accompanied him and under whose supervision founded the missions in this land.
Vallejo stressed that the common soldiers who served in Alta California were, in his view, dedicated, hardworking, and selfless. For example, he praised the performance of Cayetano Esquerra, who was a muleteer who brought mules and horses over a great distance from Sonora to Monterrey, even though, as Vallejo said,
there were no well-trodden roads, and the area teemed with a multitude of barbarous Indians.
Vallejo insisted that such dedication persisted into subsequent generations, and he cited the example of Monterrey ranchero Francisco Pacheco. He said that even though Pacheco possessed
immense numbers of cattle, he worked like a poor artisan, and he shared the fruits of his labors with the sick.
The Vallejo expressed a similar opinion about José de la Guerra y Noriega. They had actually been on opposite sides during the North-South regional struggles among the Californios in the 1830s and 1840s. In fact, Vallejo had once even put de la Guerra under house arrest in Santa Barbara. He recalled in his Recuerdos that soon after this,
I received a short note from Señora Doña María Antonia Carrillo, wife of Captain Don José de la Guerra y Noriega. She was my first cousin, or my mother's blood niece, which is the same thing. In her note, she requested a meeting with me. I immediately went to her home and asked her what had caused her to think about me. She responded, "You ought to know, Guadalupe. You have treated my husband harshly. You have ordered him to be under house arrest, and what I want is for you to lift the arrest order."
Vallejo reported that in this conversation, Maria Antonia
begged me to forget the past and establish good harmony between our families.
He replied that he was
happy to grant her request. I bet he was.
And he lifted the order for house arrest. But this somewhat uncomfortable episode did not change his overall positive opinion of José de la Guerra. He said about him,
even though he was a Spaniard by birth, de la Guerra y Noriega was extremely supportive of the people's cause and always advocated against tyranny.
Overall, in Vallejo's view,
the garrisons in Las Californias teemed with soldiers of integrity and discipline.
And in a thinly veiled attack upon the squatters who overran many ranchos in the 1850s, he insisted that these soldiers, even though they were not paid regularly,
never showed disrespect for the settlers' private property.
In Vallejo's view, in short, the most important institutions in Spanish and Mexican California were the presidios. He said bluntly,
without the presidios, the missionaries would not have been able to exist.
Now, a century and a half later, much popular and even some historical writing still regards missionaries, whether they are praised, tolerated, or vilified, as the overwhelmingly important and preeminent Hispanic actors in Spanish and Mexican California. Vallejo would strongly disagree with that. He also argued that soldiers played a leading role in the colonial task of trying to acculturate the indigenous peoples of California. Even though this task was supposed to occur at the missions, where becoming Catholic and learning Spanish-style agriculture were supposed to turn the neophytes into productive members of the Spanish Empire, Vallejo believed that no such process occurred. He said that the missionaries
never inculcated in the neophytes any principles regarding the rights of free men.
Vallejo believed that if any acculturation did occur, it was because some of the soldiers married indigenous women. Vallejo correctly said that even Sarah, who generally did not have much of a liking for the military at all, Sarah approved of such unions and appreciated their role in the colonial process.
The crucial role of ordinary people in cultural assimilation was a theme for which Vallejo had personal experience. He understood that even though the era between 1769 and 1821 was being called the Spanish era, the overwhelming majority of non-indigenous people in Alta California were not Spaniards, but rather the people who came from the Viceroyalty of New Spain. They were, in other words, Mexicans. Both he and his wife, Francisca Benicia Carrillo, were such people. They were not Spaniards, they were Mexicans. And as they and their family, who had become foreigners in the land of their birth, were trying to adjust to the new order of things after 1848, the marriages into which their children entered were a crucial part of that process. It's really interesting that none of their children married a Californio, which caused a bit of resentment on the part of Mariano Guadalupe and Francisca Benicia, because it appeared to them that their now Mexican-American children were disregarding Mexican traditions relating to marriage. There didn't seem to be any problems initially with the first marriage that occurred in their family between their oldest daughter, Epifania, or Fanny, as people referred to her, and the American soldier, John Frisbee. Frisbee converted to Catholicism a year before the marriage, which was celebrated at Mission San Francisco Solano. He later functioned as Vallejo's lawyer and financial advisor throughout the 1850s and after.
But the next family wedding played out somewhat differently. In the later 1850s, while Vallejo was attending to his late mother's estate in the Monterey region, Fanny's younger sister, Adela, told her mother that she wanted to marry John Frisbee's older brother, Levi, who was 16 years older than she was. Both parents tried to convince Adela not to do this. Mariano Guadalupe by sending a letter from Monterey, and Francisca by talking to her daughter in person. Francisca begged her husband to come home to help her deal with this situation. She wrote him, "Come, come, 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 come," 6 times. "You say that you love me and the family so much. If what you say is true, why do you leave me alone for so long now that the family needs your guidance?" But her husband remained in Monterey. Adela's response to her parents' concern was that she should not be bound by the traditional Mexican custom of contracting marriage only after receiving permission from one's parents. Now, she added that she suspected that her own parents had not completely adhered to that custom when they themselves decided to get married. And when Francisca realized that her daughter Adela's mind was made up, she made a point of taking her to San Francisco to purchase an expensive wedding dress with money that she borrowed from her husband's lawyer. Adela invited her father to the wedding, but he did not attend. For Mariano Guadalupe, the adjustment to American social norms was proving to be much more difficult than he had foreseen. But Adela's marriage was not the end of Vallejo's difficulties with his daughter's nuptial choices. In 1863, the next 2 daughters, Natalia and Jovita, informed their mother that they intended to marry another set of brothers, Attila and Arpad Harasthi. They were the sons of pioneering wine grower Augustin Harasthi, who had established the Buena Vista winery outside of Sonoma a few years earlier. And after receiving a letter from Natalia, Vallejo, who was once again in Monterey still trying to clear out his mother's estate, sourly remarked, "It's very strange that whenever I come to Monterey, the girls always want to get married. And other people always announce it before I find out. I've been assured that Jovita also is engaged to one of the other Harasthi young men. I haven't been informed about this directly, but rather through hearsay." Now, Vallejo did attend this double wedding, which was held at his home at Lacrima Montes on June the 1st, and it was officiated by a Catholic priest. But these kind of adjustments proved continually to be difficult for him. Decades later, when his daughter Maria was being courted by San Franciscan James Harry Cutter, He wrote to Francisca from San Francisco,
"As soon as I arrived, I began to inquire about the family of the young man who wants to marry Maria. So far, everything seems favorable."
but he was not happy with the American customs that this couple exhibited. A few months later, when he happened to be in a hotel room in San Francisco with both of them, he was deeply offended by the way that they were behaving with each other. He told Francisca,
"Maria and the young man Cutter have angered me. They are silly and imprudent and believe they already can do whatever they want to do in my presence."
Mariano Guadalupe was finding that acculturation turned out to be a much more difficult process than he had anticipated. Indeed, Francisca, who was a Californiana, who was much closer to the girls than her husband was and spent more time with them than he did, she seemed to handle this process much better.
A second theme in the Recuerdos was Vallejo's insistence that a desire for cultural and intellectual advancement was integral to life in California during the Mexican era. Vallejo bristled intensely in his manuscript when he described ways in which foreigners in Mexican California, mainly but not exclusively Anglo-Americans, regarded Californios as an uncivilized and uncouth group of people.
He told the story of a young man, Pedro Estrada, in 1840s Monterey. Estrada demonstrated a surprising natural ability to play the piano. And the governor said that public money should be spent to send Estrada down to Mexico City for further musical study. But a prominent Scotsman in Monterey, David Spence, thought differently on this matter. He insisted that it would be
an utter waste of money to pay teachers to teach music to young boys. It would be better if the boys learned a useful trade in order to get a job. Vallejo himself had personal experience with pianos. In fact, this particular piano was one of the 3 pianos that had been brought to California from the East Coast in 1843. Vallejo bought one of the pianos in January 1844. The piano remained largely unused at Lacrima Montis until March of 1846, when Vallejo hired Andrew Huppner, a German who had worked for the Russians at Sitka, to teach the Vallejo children how to play the piano. According to the contract, Huppner was to teach the boys and the girls. In exchange for piano lessons, Vallejo offered Huppner part of a rancho he owned slightly north of Sonoma, and that was Rancho de Agua Caliente. Within a year and a half, a visiting American naval officer by the name of Henry Wise reported that Vallejo's children could play remarkably well. That was a pretty good deal. Giving piano lessons and getting part of a rancho? God, when I took piano lessons, my mom and dad paid Mrs. Kennedy, $50 once a month, no rancho. I think this is absolutely amazing. The oldest child, Andronico, became a professional music teacher, and several of the other children demonstrated considerable musical talent. Jovita and Natalia continued their study of music at St. Mary's Hall in Sonoma and in San Francisco, and the 2 of them became accomplished pianists and singers. This image just delights me. This is something from 1862. It is a contract that Vallejo drew up with Jovita by which she was to give guitar lessons to one of her brothers 3 times a week for a year. So you can see the contract entered into by Jovita, Enrique Vallejo, and Ularislao. And then you have the witnesses, M.G. Vallejo here, and Natalia Vallejo. I think it's adorable. It really is. He's trying to, make this a professional thing. You need to do this. So he's teaching her some business skills too. It just tickles me every time I look at it. I forgot to mention that Jovita herself became locally well known for singing the Ave Maria. That was her specialty. She sang it at the Sonoma Church and for performing elsewhere. In 1877, Mariano Guadalupe wrote to Francisca from San Francisco and said that Jovita sang in the French church. She sang the Ave Maria and she sang well. For Vallejo, his children's experiences and accomplishments demonstrated what he firmly believed, which was being a Californio and being a cultured person were not at all at odds with each other.
Indeed, Vallejo argued that the family orientation of Californio culture made it superior to the more individualistic focus of 19th century American culture. As he was describing, for example, the evacuation of women and children from Monterey during the 1818 Bouchard raid, an evacuation in which he himself took part, he said,
"There were wives who refused to be separated from their husbands and children who threw themselves into their father's arms saying, 'Papa, why won't you let me die with you?'"
Vallejo believed that this behavior
sprang from deep in the souls of the old Californios who believed the love of family was far more important than any calculated plans or vile self-interest. If they had been Yankees, they probably would have behaved quite differently.
In addition to his remarks about cultural achievements, Vallejo also insisted that Californios were very interested in education. He argued that the governors of both Spanish and Mexican California were extremely interested in creating significant educational opportunities for the children of the region. But the lack of trained instructors meant that soldiers, often with rudimentary skills in reading and writing, were often recruited as teachers, and the result was not always the best. The pedagogical methods employed by these soldiers were more often like forms of military-style discipline, and these methods did little to impart a love of learning in the students. Vallejo described one particularly painful recollection that involved lessons in penmanship.
Since the examination of the students' handwriting practice was conducted much like a review of troops, that is to say, all the students would present their work in succession, the paddle never left the schoolmaster's hands, and the sounds of the blows would resonate up to 100 times in less than an hour or an hour and a half. It's a lot. Vallejo wrote to his son Platon. He wrote this letter on March 19, 1879. Fantastic handwriting. It's just beautiful. And in this letter, he indicated that there were exceptions to the practices that I just described, or that he just described for you. In this letter, he praises Platon for finally writing to him in an intelligible and elegant fashion, explaining at the very beginning of the letter, gracias a Dios que me has escrito una carta inteligible, no solamente inteligible, sino de muy gallarda letra, just beautiful handwriting, pudiéndose leer a primera vista, so you could read it, first time through. You didn't have to go over it again. And then he goes, cuando Natalia, Lulu, y María la vieron, so when the girls saw them, a la vez exclamaron, and he puts it in English. What an improvement! So the girls see the letter, it's like, whoa, our brother has improved. So then he goes on to say that, there's no excuse for bad handwriting. He goes on and on about that. But then, in the next paragraph, he goes on and reminisces about his own handwriting. And he says, with regard to handwriting, I remember that in the archives of California, there are some very old documents written by two officers, Don Manuel Rodriguez and Don Jose Maria Estudillo. These documents are worth looking at in order to admire them. So he's hammering and hammering, good handwriting, good handwriting. And going back to the letter, in that same letter he adds, Jose Maria Estudillo taught me handwriting, beginning with basic downward strokes. And I highlighted those. Remember doing that in elementary school? We all had to do like the rocking chair and all that. And he said, I even made handwriting samples that were sent to the schools in Monterey, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, and San Diego. This was in 1820, 21, and 1822. Those men were truly proud of their handwriting. That's gorgeous. I just love that.
Vallejo insisted that all of the governors during the Mexican era including Jose de Echeandia, Jose Figueroa, Juan Bautista Alvarado, and Manuel Micho Torena, attempted to improve the educational institutions of Alta California. Unfortunately, their efforts were stifled by the Mexican government's reluctance to commit additional funding to the region. In addition, Vallejo argued that the type of traditional religion that was taught in the schools did nothing to help the students develop their own independent moral character. He reserved special scorn for the 16th century catechism that was used in the Monterrey schools he attended. This catechism was written by Jesuit Jeronimo de Ripalda.
And he's very angry when he starts talking about this. He underlines 3 times, Father Ripalda's catechism. Who among the old Californios does not know Father Ripalda? Is there anyone with even the slightest ability to reason and freedom of conscience who does not detest that monstrous and fanatical code? This code is similar to a venomous serpent that wraps itself around a young person's heart in order to slowly devour it.
Now, Vallejo was honest enough to acknowledge that his own views were not shared by every Californio, and that the traditional religion expressed, for instance, in the Ripalda Catechism and by the missionaries found favor among some. For instance, he sardonically remarked about Jose de la Guerra y Noriega.
Every time he has the opportunity to talk about me, he refers to me as the heretic.
In his overall remarks about culture and education, Vallejo was explicitly rejecting views current in the United States about Californios, such as this statement in Alfred Robinson's widely read book, Life in California.
The men are generally indolent and addicted to many vices, caring little for the welfare of their children, who, like themselves, grow up unworthy members of society.
As was the case with cultural attainments, Vallejo's arguments about education derived in part from his own and from his family's experience. As a child in Monterrey, he himself had received special tutoring from Governor Pablo Vicente de Solá in Spanish literature and in current events. And when he became a father, he insisted that his own children be educated as broadly as possible.
Now, his desire that his daughters learn to play the piano carried over into his educational goals for all of his children. He insisted that his daughters and his sons receive the exact same type of formal education. So this manner of thinking was something that made Vallejo quite unusual for the age in which he had been born and lived. The 2 youngest girls, Luisa and Maria, first attended St. Catherine's Convent in Benicia and then the Convent of Notre Dame in San Jose.
Now, his wife Francisca knew that her daughter's experience were much different from those of her own childhood half a century earlier. At that time, she remembered,
if girls were taught anything at all, they basically learned what was in the primer, so that they could read the prayer of the faithful, the creed, and the novena to the Virgin. It wasn't our parents' fault. It was the way things were done back then.
Throughout her life, Francisca was very self-conscious and somewhat embarrassed at times about her own limited education. In a letter from 1863, we can see how Francisca practices writing her husband's name at the top of the page, trying to make it as legible as possible. Guadalupe, Guadalupe, Guadalupe.
Yeah, she was very self-conscious of her writing. She'd always say, I haven't written to you in a long time because it takes me time to do it. I'm embarrassed. But to be perfectly honest, that is very legible. I have seen much worse from students. And I don't paddle their hands.
But on the other hand, despite this, Francisca herself proved to be a very, very strong woman. During the Bear Flag Rebellion, she secretly set arms to Californios in the countryside who were preparing to attack the Bear Flag stronghold at Sonoma. When John C. Fremont personally confronted her, He said,
Senora, do you not realize that you are deserving of a very serious punishment for having supplied arms to the enemies of the government of California?
and she brazenly replied,
I have not given arms to the enemies, but rather to the friends of the government of California. Those people under your command have no God and no laws. They have placed on the flagpole a rag that has a bear painted on it. And that is the same as saying that they are thieves.
And when Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie, another military officer there, asked Francisca if she had any weapons left, she stated that she had only 4 pistols, which she had locked up in the chest of drawers in her room. She told Gillespie that she was keeping them to defend her honor and to defend the lives of her daughters in case some of the bears tried to barge into their bedroom. Now, as we've seen, Vallejo was not always happy with his educated daughter's life choices. But all of these frustrations never led him once to express the slightest regret that he had about his decision that they be educated. And throughout his treatment of the themes of education and culture in the Recuerdos, Vallejo's overall point was that Californios were very concerned about education and even more interested and accomplished in cultural refinement than Europeans or Americans. As he approvingly quoted Juan Bautista Alvarado in another part of the Recuerdos,
The Yankees have money on the brain. Now, a third theme in the Recuerdos involved Vallejo's attempt to deal with the complicated relationship between the Californios and California's indigenous peoples. In common with many leading colonists in Spanish America, Vallejo divided the indigenous people into 2 groups: Gentiles, who remained outside of the Spanish orbit and were often referred to as bárbaros, and neophytes, who had come under the influence of the Spanish system and had been baptized. Regarding the non-mission Indians, Vallejo described his own efforts to conquer native peoples north of Sonoma as an example of what he called the Roman policy of divide and conquer. The allusion to Rome was appropriate since Vallejo always thought of himself as a kind of patriarch to people he regarded as lower in the social order than himself, whether they were indigenous people or other Californios. He helped Sarmiento, and you would know Sarmiento by his other name, Chief Solano. He helped him fight against the chief's traditional enemies, and he used Sarmiento's Susun warriors to subdue other native groups. In his manuscript, Vallejo consistently inflated the number of indigenous peoples against whom he battled, as well as the number of groups he said he successfully subdued. By saying this, Vallejo was associating himself with the Spanish imperial struggles against the indigenous peoples of northern New Spain, especially the Apaches and the Comanches. Also, he was writing the Recuerdos just as the U.S. military was waging well-publicized wars against the Plains Indians. Vallejo's message here was that the Americans were not so different from their Iberian and Mexican predecessors as they wanted to believe they were.
Now, Vallejo's opinion of the neophytes, the mission Indians, stemmed from his belief, which we've already noted, that the mission system was a failure at acculturating indigenous Californians. He reported favorably on a speech that he said that Romualdo Pacheco had delivered to a group of neophytes at Mission San Juan Capistrano. According to Vallejo,
Pacheco informed them that their present condition was extremely pitiful, for they were purposely being kept in a state of ignorance, and the education they were being given was more fitting for slaves than for free men.
In a word, in Vallejo's view, the missions failed at acculturation because they failed at education.
And a fourth theme of the Recuerdos was the nature of historical memory. Vallejo's relationship with Hubert Howe Bancroft illustrated this very clearly. As is well known, Bancroft regarded himself as the sole author of his historical works, and even in his own day, he was roundly criticized for not acknowledging the work of his staff members in producing the 30 volumes of his collected works. In this, he differed very much from Vallejo, who regarded his own historical works as part of a larger community effort. The time that Vallejo spent with Cerruti was crucial in solidifying his conviction that his historical enterprise was community-based. Bancroft wanted Vallejo to introduce Cerruti to Californios who had documents that Bancroft wished to acquire, as I had mentioned earlier. But as Vallejo and Cerruti were traveling around Northern California, Vallejo talked to these people first, and he convinced them that as a condition of their giving Bancroft the documents he was seeking, they should first give their own personal reminiscences to Cerruti or to other members of Bancroft's staff. Vallejo followed his own advice, and he convinced Cerruti to interview his brother Salvador, along with Isidora Filomena, who was the widow of Chief Solano. And this was done before Vallejo began dictating his Recuerdos to Cerruti.
Vallejo strongly believed that such community reminiscences were a crucial part of the history of California. As he was engaging with Cerruti in August of 1874, Vallejo wrote to Alvarado, and he told him,
"Before we die, it is necessary to narrate, at the very least, the true history of our country, since we have been so apathetic in terms of writing it down."
And to illustrate his reliance on community memory, in the prologue to his Recuerdos, Vallejo specifically acknowledged and thanked a number of Californios, such as Juan Bautista Alvarado, Pablo de la Guerra, with whom he had served both at the Constitutional Convention and in the first session of the California legislature, Ramon de Saldo, Maria Amparo de Ruiz de Burton, his son Platon, Jose Fernandez, all of whom he said had encouraged and helped him in his efforts.
Vallejo also believed that accurate community memory of the past could have a profound effect upon the present. He regarded his history as a genuine dialogue between the present and the past. This approach also put him at odds with a number of 19th century writers. Many American historians of Vallejo's time allowed the then current chorus of beneficial American expansion and manifest destiny to crowd out actual lived experiences of earlier inhabitants of the American West. But Vallejo believed that the fantasies of a particular present, such as the romanticization of the missions during the later 19th century, could not be allowed to define the past. He also argued that the present could not be adequately understood without a nuanced appreciation of the contributions of all actors, especially rank and file Mexican military personnel, in creating the present in which historians and their audiences lived. Certainly, Vallejo's own cultural presuppositions blinded him to the way he often excluded indigenous Californians from these considerations. But his own limited views don't destroy the validity of the perspective he imperfectly adopted.
Finally, Vallejo hoped that his readers would acquire a greater understanding and appreciation of the crucial roles that Californios had played in the development of the west coast of North America. In turn, he hoped this would lead to a greater acceptance of the Mexican-American community to which he belonged as being genuine members of present-day California. He stated in his prologue,
California had been elevated to the height of prosperity by the sons of the founding generation of Californial soldiers.
He hoped that his history would convince people that the then prevalent American notion, which was that California's well-being resulted from the gold rush and from the American presence in the region, was not true. He also hoped that his work would make Anglo-American Californians more genuinely appreciative of the Spanish and Mexican roots of contemporary California, and that it would encourage a more sympathetic understanding of the people in present-day California who were tied to those roots. In the last paragraph of his manuscript, he bluntly stated,
I declare that in spite of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the North Americans treated the Californios as if they were a conquered people.
He strongly believed that one way to increase understanding would be for the Anglos to learn more about this unfamiliar people in their midst. And in the same final section of his manuscript, he observed,
French and German are taught in the schools of San Francisco. Why are there no classes in Spanish?
And analogous questions, questions of inclusion and questions of identity, still confront historians and citizens today.
Vallejo finished writing his Recuerdos, all 1,506 pages, in August 1875, almost 150 years ago. We feel extremely honored and very privileged to have been able to assist Mariano Guadalupe in this long journey toward publication of his work. Our role in this endeavor took much longer than a year and a half. It took 10 years. But it was so worth the time and the effort. We are confident that those who read the Recuerdos will gain a deeper understanding of the history of the period and of the people who were part of that history. We also hope that readers will feel that they've learned more about the Recuerdos author, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, a man who was so determined and so dedicated to setting the record straight. In today's presentation, we barely skimmed the surface regarding the people, places, and events that he wrote about in the Recuerdos. We do hope that we have piqued your interest and that you will want to read our translation of Vallejo's amazing history, and that shook down to 1,488 typed pages. Do not let the size of the 2 volumes, it is a 2-volume set, intimidate you. When the 2 volumes arrived at our home a month or 2 ago, I opened the box and I said, holy something. I said, wow, these monsters are heavy. And I went and weighed them. And together they weigh close to 8 pounds. So you can get exercise as well when you're reading. But all kidding aside, we want you to rest assured that the information contained in each volume is worth reading, and we have provided you with a very, very extensive index to help you pick out what you would like to read. I also would like to call your attention to the final chapter in the companion volume of essays that we put together. That chapter, chapter 8, is one of my favorites. This is where we present a selection of letters that Mariano Guadalupe and Francisca Benicia wrote to one another from 1846 to 1888. These letters are like a window into their marriage and demonstrate what life was like for them and for their family during the first decades of American rule. We have collected, transcribed, and translated close to 180 of their personal letters, and we have also included letters from their children that treat the themes that they treat in their letters. And all of these letters together form the basis of our next book, which we hope to get to our editors in the fall, and that book will be called A Family in Transition. So I know this is kind of forward of me, but I thought I would put the information about the books. I'm sorry, but I know that they have the books here in the store, but also they're available from University of Oklahoma Press, Amazon, Barnes Noble, and they would make a great Mother's Day gift. Mother's Day is Sunday. That would work. Father's Day, whatever. Think about it. But this one last picture. Here we are. The first picture, we were next to him, no book. You recall? I was with him, Bob was with him. But this picture was taken on April 13th, when this was our first presentation in Sonoma. And we just had to go and say hello to MGV, as we refer to him, my man. And we put the Recuerdos right there. And I said to him, we did it. The 3 of us did it. So really thank you from the bottom of my heart for your kind attention. It means so much to us to be able to share this information with you, to share this wonderful family with you. And we have a descendant here in the audience, and Martha McGettigan is right here. She's descended from Platon, the child who finally wrote legibly. And it means a lot to have you here, Martha, and I hope that we've made you proud. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions, we're happy to answer. Or any comments? Or if you just all want to go by. Thank you.
How would you, first of all, thank you very much. That was amazing. How would you compare the coastal experience of the Californios to maybe people that are living in more inland, like Santa Fe or Tucson, or places that are a little more removed in Alta California in this period?
Well, I think the main reason is, the main difference is that California had a huge coastline. So from a very early period, they were very involved in trade with Mexico, and through the Mexican trade, they became somewhat involved with the Pacific trade as well. So California, Alta California especially, was much more connected to the Pacific Rim than New Mexico or Arizona, or even Baja California. And I think that's important.